Today we're going to make a table out of a single sheet of plywood. I'm going to make all the cuts with my circular saw, and in order to reduce the amount of sanding that I have to do, I'm going to put on a nice fresh blade. For this first table, I used a single sheet of 3/4 inch thick furniture grade plywood with a poplar finish. I clamped down a straight edge and then made 2 long rip cuts down the edge of the plywood. I then switched my straight edge and ripped some pieces off of the end. A speed square came in handy when I was cutting the strips of plywood to length. I used a ruler to mark out the angled cuts for the legs. My circular saw is pretty accurate, and with the fresh blade it cuts nice and easy, so I just did these by hand. For the smaller support pieces, I cut them to length and then marked out the angle corner to corner and cut that as well. I used sandpaper to lightly round over the edges of the pieces. I started the assembly process by gluing together the 4 pieces that would make each of the legs. I added a couple finish screws from the back side, but that's totally not necessary. I then glued and screwed the support pieces together. Once the glue had cured on the support pieces, I was ready to assemble the entire leg. I wanted a little bit of extra support for the table, so I ripped off 2 more strips 2.5 inches wide. I also cut some triangular pieces off the corners. This is both for aesthetic reasons and also to create additional supports for the inside of the table. I laid the legs out on the underside of the tabletop and then measured the pieces that are going to create the inside frame that's going to help support the tabletop. The triangular pieces were a little bit too long, so I marked a 45-degree angle and then trimmed them. I then glued these trimmed angle pieces to the 2.5 inch wide strips that I had cut for supports. It didn't have single pieces that were long enough, so I had to kind of patch some together, but there was plenty of wood to do this. I glued and screwed the inner frame pieces to the legs. I took the ends that I had trimmed off the triangular pieces, trimmed the ends of those, and then glued those into the gaps of the legs. I glued and screwed the corner pieces together to make 2 braces for the inside frame of the table. Now I'm going to paint this table, so I wasn't that careful about placing the screws, and I also was just going to use some putty to cover up the heads of them. I painted the table with a couple coats of white paint and then glued the base to the tabletop. The table is quite strong, and overall I'm happy with how it looks, but I thought that the 2.5 inch wide inside frame kind of blurred out some of the definition that really established a cool aesthetic. So I made a few tweaks to the design, and this time reinforced the underside with plywood strips that were glued and screwed flat to the underside of the tabletop. I also experimented with pine plywood, which was cheaper than the furniture grade poplar plywood, but tended to warp a little bit more. It still made the table doable, but it was a little bit trickier and I had to be a little more careful. I decided not to paint the second table, so I was much more careful about placing screws, and I also relied a lot more on glue than I did the first one. I did like the idea, however, of using screws in a decorative pattern to fasten through the top of the tabletop and into the legs below. I really like how the profile of this version of the table is much more visually dramatic, and it's still super strong. I think CNC machines and 3D printers are awesome and provide all sorts of new possibilities for making and designing. But for this project, I wanted to show that you still could make a really cool piece of furniture using really affordable and more common tools. I also think it's really great when ideas from both genres of making cross-fertilize. I don't think I would have thought of this idea for a table if I hadn't seen some really cool CNC designs. For more detailed instructions, check out my website, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, be sure to follow me on Instagram. My sister Jessie also has her own channel now and is doing some really cool projects, so be sure to check out the link in the description box below. Check out Ryobi Nation, where you can post your own projects and have a chance to win the same tools that I use. Check out some of our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks, bye.